We were so discombobulated we even counted up. So, seminary gladiatorial battles.
Seminary gladiatorial battles, indeed.
You mentioned that in the
Yes,
Facebook
I
chat, and I'm
did.
like, what does this even mean?
We have interests that are piqued.
Indeed. So, yesterday morning, as of the recording of this particular episode, so that would be Sunday morning, several of us were sitting around the breakfast tables and discussing an all-out gladiatorial tournament with all of the seminarians as participants and what the most fair first round pairings would be. And so we were discussing, and this spanned like 3 different tables. so it wasn't just like an isolated conversation at our table. You know, like half the dining room was in on this thing, and the rector was sitting at one of the tables participating in this, which was
so
probably the best part of the whole occasion.
Oh, goodness.
So basically, it's like, I bet you could take him on in a fight, and so that would be the most.
Yeah, they were like trying to figure out the pairings that would make the most enjoyable for spectators.
Oh, sure.
The most fair fight, or the most like interesting or unique.
Sure. So either get them evenly matched or have a unique dynamic that is fun to play out. Interesting.
Right, precisely. And so one of the guys, of course, that really likes to talk, he's like a big theology guy, he got paired against himself. And he's like, oh man, the spectators are going to lose out on that one.
That's funny.
Yeah. Shout out Greg in the
Hi,
horridly unlikely event that you listen to this at any point in your life.
Over time, I feel like the more we reference people, the more they actually start listening to the podcast and discovering that we have
that they actually like our podcast.
That, and that they've been referenced multiple times.
What, like your brother-in-law?
Like my brother-in-law, Nathan's sister-in-law's husband.
That's possibly the most convoluted way one can refer to one's own brother.
He was going through, he listens to the podcast time and again on his way to work, and he said he's beginning to pick up on the times we reference him, like a certain other person.
A certain other person who
we won't name you, but we have faith you'll know what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Whose particular pet peeve is really hard to reproduce on a microphone such as this. So I guess you'll be spared that particular torture, but rest assured that I would do it if I could.
Yeah, John is just on the podcast so much he is just the reference to himself every time he appears. So enough said there. But yeah, Andrew perked up when I asked him if he'd like to help us with a Batman episode at some point.
Ooh.
So stay tuned for that. That might be in the offing. We will see.
That would be a very fun
logistics.
episode to do. Yeah,
Yes.
it would just be about how do we get him here or get him recorded.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
We might
shouldn't
have to
be
sacrifice
too
a
hard
little
given
bit
the
of
way
audio quality.
we do things presently.
Mm-hmm.
Not terribly. Anything else new in the world besides gladiator fights with seminarians?
And the rector overseeing all of it in his
as it should
Benedictine
be.
habit.
As it should
He
be.
just gives us the old
Audible thumbs down.
Audible thumbs down. Anyway, we have a theatrical production coming up this weekend.
Ooh.
One of our spiritual directors is a former professor of theater at the University of Kentucky. So
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
So he's got some chops.
He's got some playwriting skills. And he wrote a little production about Gerard Manley Hopkins, who is kind of a contemporary of St. John Henry Newman.
The name sounds
Yeah.
familiar.
Okay.
He was a poet, and he kind of was an interesting character, and he was a Jesuit, and Father Al was in formation with the Jesuits for some time, so he has a kind of connection with that there. So we're putting on this play this weekend. I'm helping out with music. So,
There you
Very cool.
Blare
Yeah.
the trumpet forth.
yes, the trumpet will be blaring in English churches and all of that sort of thing.
Lovely. Well, that should be quite fun.
Yeah. Sounds like a fun time.
I have today was a rather crazy Monday as we record this. I am working on a video project that involved interviewing multiple people at multiple locations and very much running around with cameras. So it was busy but rather delightful because any day I get to mess around with cameras is a good day. So, yes, that's basically, and there's not really a ton else happening in the world other than it is 60 degrees warmer than it was this time last week, and yet it is only in the 30s. It got up to a whopping, I think it got up to 40 today. I think that was in the forecast. So
Okay.
the one normal thing that's happened this winter is our traditional February thaw that lasts about a week. And then, or false spring as I've called it in the past. But, and others maybe,
Yes.
I don't know.
Fool's Spring,
Yes.
as it were.
Yeah.
Now in Indiana, spring is like genuinely starting right around now. So
Oh, lovely.
at least as far as I can tell, this is my first year here, but
Mm-hmm.
I mean 30 degrees certainly feels like spring to me.
Did you guys catch any of that nasty weather the middle of the country got while we were freezing up here?
Nasty audible air quotes.
Okay.
By the rest of
Na-
the country's standards.
Nasty by the rest of the country's standards. Very,
Which, to
par
be
for
fair
the
to them, they weren't really equipped to handle, apparently. So,
Right.
par for the course as far as Minnesota goes.
yeah. But hopefully y'all are getting what you need and get your power back soon. So if anybody from Texas particularly is listening,
Would
praying
that be
for
a statistic you'd be able to look up on like your
maybe,
things,
I have
like where
no
they're
idea.
listening?
I haven't checked in a long time.
It's no more granular than what country they're from.
Oh,
so.
sure.
Oh, okay. My mom knows about the two. Or
Really?
no, was that Michelle? I forget. Both of them were talking about it.
Are
I
our
had-
two listeners?
I was explaining to the concept to them, and they sort of got it. But I was at home with family over the weekend, so that's what I did.
Mhm.
I went cross country skiing for the first time. I usually end up doing it once a year.
For
I
the
wish I
first-
could do it more often, but especially this time around, I was pretty winded by the end of it because I'm not.
Apparently, the people around here don't know what cross-country skiing is. Like, I had several people who were just like, "What is that? What are you talking about?" And I'm like,
It's an Olympic sport for crying out loud.
Wait. I mean, in fairness,
I think maybe
I
it's-
guess you guys don't really get snow down here all that often.
Yeah. Is it
So
is it
I can
also called
understand it.
Nordic skiing? I think some people call it that. Maybe they recognize it as such. I don't know. But
I described the process to them, and they were still just flabbergasted that this is a thing.
It's like,
Yep.
wait,
and the trails were,
horizontal?
Oh,
yeah.
okay. So like, imagine downhill skiing, but instead of going downhill,
rotate
you
that till
just
it's
you ski flat across the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, "What?"
And the skis are long and thin instead of hourglass shaped, so you can glide along the snow. It was like the perfect temperature for it on Saturday, and then it warmed up on Sunday. So when it gets too warm, it gets sticky, and the friction makes it very difficult to ski.
Mhm.
But they had just groomed the trails as well, which made it very nice. But yeah, I was in the lead of the pack until the very end, and then my older brother passed me, which is acceptable. The younger brother, who is a rather thin fellow, little could afford to put on a few pounds, was being hemming and hawing about his aches and pains all the way through. It's like, dude, put on some body weight so you don't like fall apart, blow away in the wind. But it was fun. My mom really likes spending time with the kids, and she was in her happy place this weekend. So played a bunch of code names, drank a lot of mules, Moscow mules. Courtesy
Just
of my
like
brother.
liquefy crossbreed horse and donkey.
Yes, correct. That's how it works.
Right.
Put them in a blender and slurp them down.
With a little bit of
That's-
ice chunks and cranberry juice.
Yeah.
And ginger beer. But yeah, anything new with you, Nathan?
I got to play with Transformers in class.
Ah,
It took you a second.
yeah.
Took you a second, but no, I'm not talking about the robots in disguise plastic toys. I'm talking about
Robots in disguise.
I'm talking about like a magnetic square with coils of wire wrapped around it
I
that steps
understand
up and steps
Where you're
down
going with this now?
currents. It's well, you know how you change like currents from like high current to low current so you can go
Yeah.
into your house, but then like you have to step them up to go into the power lines. They have to go through a transformer to change the current, and so we had to learn how to calculate that and how to read that and how to do stuff, and it was
I used to solder those onto circuit boards, like little miniature ones.
right.
They're rather heavy.
So the concept is easy enough to understand. It's not like it's going over your head. It's just like if I started talking about how the number of coils on one side, the number of coils on the other side, the mutual inductance and all that stuff, that would start to go over your head because you're not sure what
Yeah.
that means. I'm not sure what that means
Educational
entirely.
content, kids. Learn all about the seminary and electrical engineering. It's almost like a Monsignor Gehring homily.
No, but school is tough. I mean, turns out engineering's hard,
Yeah, I've
but
heard
it's good.
nice.
I'm yeah. It's
Good
I don't know.
stuff.
Nothing specifically new to report on my life front.
Yeah, we do have something new to offer in this week's podcast. We're the Palladium Papists. I'm James,
I'm Nathan.
And I'm Riley.
and this week we are introducing novel ideas. Oh, a novel idea. So yes, novel ideas is the part of the show where we talk about ideas we have about novels. We'll workshop that a bit, but it's pretty self-explanatory. So,
In which we have ideas about
Like-
novels.
Introduce it like a Winnie the Pooh chapter or what?
no,
Perhaps.
I actually read
but-
those multiple times.
They're
When I was
fun.
a kid.
Anyway,
But we're not talking about Winnie the Pooh.
We're not
We're
talking
not
about
talking about
A.A.
Winnie the
Milne and
Pooh.
his PTSD. We're talking about another.
we're talking about James Islington's Licanius trilogy today.
How do you spell that?
Licanius.
Okay.
You're gonna have to name the podcast.
Audible
episode.
spelling.
Audible spelling. I mean, it actually is audible this time.
That's true.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so
We're not sponsored by Audible though.
No.
So.
Unfortunately, I would really not be. I would not complain at all if we happened to be reached out to for a sponsorship deal by a certain audiobook company. But
We'd have to send them audio files of us reading what the email would be out loud instead of just an email. To them.
audible emailing, as it were.
Yes.
Isn't that just like
A phone
phone call?
Yeah, but recorded. Anyway, continue speaking of this book series.
It's a trilogy, as the name suggests, of books. The first one was published around 2014, The Shadow of What Was Lost. The second book published, I think, 2016 or 17, can't remember, called An Echo of Things to Come. And the third book came out early 2020, is called The Light of All That Falls.
So pretty recent, like very recent.
It
Yeah,
only
contemporary.
concluded about a year ago.
Sure.
So, it has a very interesting, like, both magic system and kind of theology to it. You know,
Interesting.
most fantasy series have some sort of theology that is applied to their particular fantasy world.
Right.
Mhm.
And
Kind of
most of
origin
the
story
time, most of the time in sort of more contemporary fantasy stuff, that's almost always Eastern. You know,
Mhm.
like particularly the Zoroastrian kind of dualism stuff. There's this evil versus good dynamic, and there's
Mhm.
some being that embodies that. Whereas this series of books really has a uniquely Christian way of, I mean, it's not almost, it is blatantly obvious that it's Christian. Like, the name of the god in this universe is El. So, I mean, they are not trying to hide what they're doing here, but
Is this what friend Jasper recommended to you a couple years ago?
yes.
I should.
Jasper, shout out Jasper, a seminary
Jasp?
of a neighboring diocese, recommended the first book to me, and I read it, and I was like, this good book.
This is good stuff. I remember him telling you about that back in the olden days.
Back in the days.
In the before times.
In the before times when Rasper was still around.
When Rasper was still walked among us men.
But anyway, they are some really dense books. So I'm not going to get super duper in depth on the synopsis simply because there's so much happening that we'd be here all night if I tried to give you a rundown of all of the significant events.
Sure.
So I haven't had as much time to put this together as I would like, so we'll see how it goes.
Mm-hmm.
So the story sort of begins with a prologue 20 years before the present day, in which there's this sort of oligarchical government run by the augurs, you know, spelt like an ice augur for you Minnesotans, but,
Yep.
you know, one who predicts the future, that kind of augur.
Which to the uninitiated is basically a giant drill. But
Yes. To those of you who aren't from
A
Minnesota,
drill that pierces the future.
ice is
drill that
water
pierces
when it gets
the
very
ice.
cold. for the uninitiated.
I don't know that anyone's that uninitiated.
It occurs in nature, believe it or not. Anyway.
There's an argument to be made that ice is a mineral because it occurs in nature and all of that stuff. But anyway, let's get back on track.
Augurs.
So the augurs have the ability to see the future via visions. So when they're sleeping, they'll have a vision of some future event. And they'll record it. And, you know, inevitably all of these come to pass. There has never been a vision in history that has not come to pass. You know, pretty much exactly the way they saw it. And despite any attempts to change, you know, the foreknowledge of the future does not allow them to change it in any capacity. It just inevitably happens, no matter what they do. So that understandably gives them a lot of power within the society, and so they basically run the show. About 20 years before the present, some of the visions appear to start being false. They start to not happen exactly the way that they were seen. And, you know, it causes a lot of problems because, you know, the nation makes decisions based on these visions because they have hitherto been reliable. And they start, like, losing battles and stuff because they're trying to rely on this information, which seems to no longer be good. So eventually a coup happens and they kill all of the augurs and take over with a new sort of totalitarian government. And the gifted, which are kind of like this other class of magic user, they manipulate essence, which is this sort of like the force but tangible, and has some rules to it. You know, it's kind of like the life energy that binds things together, and it is the, you know, you can get it from fire or kind of anything that's sort of like giving off energy or has energy within it.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are sort of placed under this agreement not to use their powers against people anymore by the new government that is called administration. And they have to obey any orders that they're given and all of that kind of stuff. So at the present, a young man named Davian is studying how to be, he's a gifted, and he's studying how to, use his powers at a school called Caladel. And he, despite the fact that he has the mark of the tenets on him, which means that you've used essence at some point, he has no ability to, control it reliably. Mm-hmm. His powers are very weak, and he really can't, consciously use essence. And so this is a big deal for a gifted, because if you can't pass your exams when you turn 16, you get turned into a shadow, which essentially means that you get stripped of your powers and lose all of your memories. Mm-hmm. And you're just kind of useless and inert, and it's really painful and it sucks.
Not cool.
Not a fun time. So he is not looking forward to that, and trying desperately to figure out something that to do about that. Further, he has the ability to tell when someone is lying without fail. He gets a little headache whenever someone lies in front of him, which is an ability only an augur should have.
Oh.
But they're all supposed to be dead.
Oh.
So that is also concerning, because if they found out he was an augur, they would just kill him on the spot. And so this man comes to adjudicate the trials. His name is Ilseth Tenvar, and he happens to know that Davian is in fact an augur. And they've discovered that he is, and they're yeah, they're definitely going to kill you if they find out. So here's this little bronze box. It's going to take you somewhere where you can learn how to use your augur powers safely. And his best friend, Wirr, spelled W-I-R-R, for some reason, decide to just skip town and go wherever this little box is pointing them. So they take off, and sort of the next morning, Asha, one of their friends, wakes up and finds everyone else in the school dead. So if they had stayed, they'd be dead too. Oh. And so she is the only one left alive, and everyone else has been brutally murdered, and she's like, what in the heck's going on here? And she finds Ilseth in there, and he sort of has to explain away his being there, and he gets trapped into admitting that he was complicit in the attack happening. Mm-hmm. Now, Asha doesn't know that her two friends might be alive. So she's kind of that's bad. I don't like this guy. But he, of course, knows that she knows too much, so he has to deal with her. He doesn't really want to kill her, so he just turns her into a shadow, which erases her memories and removes all of her powers. And so Davian and Wirr head off to this country. They're just following the box, heading along. The country they're going into, the gifted are not looked well upon. In fact, it's the country is populated by zealots in their religion. Being a gifted is even just being born with that power makes you liable to be just executed. So they're not really a fan. They don't like that. So they get tracked down by some hunters, and their job is to go around killing the gifted, because that's something they like to do. And some random other hunter comes and rescues them. And the only reason she'll give them for doing that is that someone named Talkamar has arranged for it to be so. And so they're like, okay, that's thanks, buddy. We appreciate. They continue on following the little box, and it leads them to this prisoner. He's kind of locked up in this caravan, and so they're like, it stops, and the box also stops telling them to keep going. So they're like, okay, this the dude. So they bust him out of the caravan. His name is Caden. He's like, oh, gee, thanks for rescuing me, guys. I appreciate. And they were having a nice little time, but then all of a sudden this creature called a Shateth attacks them out of nowhere. And Caden miraculously fights it off with just like an insane display of power. Like his essence abilities are like nothing they've ever seen before. And he's, weakened from the bindings they used on him. So like, this isn't even my final form.
Goodness.
At the same time, Asha also encounters a Shateth, but this one doesn't want to attack her for some reason. He doesn't really reveal why. And she meets up with a mysterious man named Signer. He runs a little refuge for shadows to hang out in. And the government's interested in Asha because she was a really good student and was definitely going to pass her tests, and all of a sudden they made her a shadow. So like, why did that happen? She was at that school where everyone died. She didn't die. What's up with this? So they figure that she has they can learn something from her. Signer says, yeah, I bet you could. So I'm going to have you go in there and do some spying for me. Because I like shadows, and you guys get oppressed by everyone. Nobody likes you.
Nobody likes you. You don't have any friends.
So there's like this giant barrier of essence blocking off the big spooky land to the north where all of the bad things are.
Ooh, spooky.
Big spooky land. And this barrier seems to be deteriorating. And that's obviously no good, because if the barrier deteriorates any further, all of the bad, scary things will come out and kill everyone. And that's something we'd like to avoid.
That is a suboptimal outcome.
So, this guy named Taris Sar, he's another gifted that they meet up with along the way. He figures that Caden is somehow tied in with all of this, given how extremely powerful he is. And he says, all right, well, you, Mr. Big Powerful Guy, let's see if you can help us figure something out here.
Essence guy is somehow connected to the barrier.
Yeah, he's connected to the barrier, the boundary, as they call it, deteriorating. And so they think that they should go investigate. They make their way through this abandoned old spooky city full of mist called Licanius.
Oh,
and
we don't go to Ravenholm. That's what I was going to say.
We don't go to Ravenholm, unfortunately. But while they're there, they find this strange portal-looking thingy, and Davian gets sucked through it.
Oh.
Being the augur among them, he's kind of like... The augurs also have the ability to manipulate time to a certain extent.
Oh. That makes sense, seeing the future and whatever.
And so he gets sucked through this rift in time back to the before times in Licanius, meets this guy named Malshash, who teaches him how to use his augur powers. This is essentially where he was supposed to meet up with Caden and then get taken to this time travel portal to go and learn how to use his powers a bit. And so people are monitoring the boundary, and they have this army of soldiers that have these helmets with no eye holes in them, so they call them the blind, and they're all kind of just standing there menacingly along the boundary, and they're like, I figure they're probably going to invade us here in a bit. So Asha and we're trying to figure out the best way to defend kind of the capital city, because that is where they figure people will be attacking. Of Ilan, that's the name of the capital. And they try to convince the government that there are some issues, and they're like, this thing has been standing for like 2,000 years. No way there's any issue with it.
There's
No way into the mountain. We totally would have noticed if anything was wrong with it, so there can't be.
That's kind
Fun fact, no.
Fun fact. Yes, there is something indeed wrong with it. But more on that later. The blind get through. They launch a big attack, kill a bunch of people, and they meet some more.
Do they lead each other?
Well, yes, but actually no.
So someone else is leading the blind, not the blind.
Someone else is leading the blind. The blind are not leading the blind.
I see.
Unfortunately.
I see.
There is
Don't make blind assumptions like that.
yeah, that's not a very that's not very cash money of you.
Walked into that joke with both eyes open.
Didn't see it coming.
I can see that now.
Monkey.
Monkey.
So anyway, what
You have
happens
You have
during
shown
or
me
after the
monkey.
attack?
So the government is very unhelpful, despite the fact that all of these scary blind have attacked, and they're really hard to fight with essence because the armor they have just kind of absorbs it.
Oh.
So they're like, we're going to have to deal with this ourselves. And the king gets killed in this battle, who we find out is related to, he's the prince of the nation. So
Oh.
he's just kind of been
That
casually.
would mean he's related to the king.
That would mean he's related to king. I think
Like
the
an
king's
heir?
actually. I think the king's actually his uncle,
Right, but
Oh,
he's
okay.
the heir.
but he's the next in line.
He's the next in line, as it were.
The heir and the heir apparent, I think, is what they would call that.
Being a gifted, him being the king would be obviously problematic
Mhm.
because to change the tenets, which are these rules that bind all of the gifted, you need a gifted and an administrator to do that. And we're being both of them simultaneously could just change things willy-nilly.
Ah.
Sure.
But because he's a good guy, he refuses to do that. So, but the very fact that he is a gifted represents some big problems for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, Caden, meanwhile, meets these scary, I don't know if they're scary, menacing creatures called the Lith, who kind of fill in some blanks in his memory, because he wakes up with no memories. He's just like, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know who I am. I just know that my name is Caden and that you just rescued me. So he is kind of like slowly gaining back memories over time as he makes his way through the world. And so he meets up with these creatures, and they're kind of like big flaming dudes that are just very angry and aggressive in general, but it's mostly Caden's fault, as they tell him. So the reason he doesn't remember anything is because he intentionally erased all of his memories in order to retrieve the sword Licanius, which is what the series is named after.
Okay.
Because he made an agreement with them many, many years ago that they took Licanius because it's a powerful sword that can kill the Venerate, which Caden is one of. They're these immortal people that are extremely powerful and can use the same powers that the augurs have, just better because they've been doing it a lot longer. but they're immortal, and even if they get killed, they'll just resurrect in a new body, sometime later. And the Licanius is the only weapon ever created that's able to kill them once and for all. So they took it from him so that they can use it against the Venerate. As most of them are convinced that El is trying to... I don't know if we addressed this. Yeah, we did. El is the god in this in this universe. So they're convinced that El is trying to reach the city of Delanis so he can use the rift to go back in time and sort of make right all of the events of history, sort of stop all of these bad things from ever happening. Whereas Talkamar has learned that the one they are referring to as El is most likely actually Shamaloth, who is this sort of evil beings sort of analogous to Satan. It's never explicitly said, but he's like this force of darkness that's going to kill everyone in the world if he gets through the boundary. And that's why the boundary is there, to keep him in there. They and the Venerate think it's El. So they've kind of been deceived into thinking that.
But they were all of them deceived.
For another sword was made. So yeah. But Caden makes this deal that he can get the sword. He can keep it for a year and a day until he can figure out how to release the Lith from their prison that he put them in a long time ago. Because he sort of did a genocide on their race for reasons.
I see.
He's regretful about that and wants to, make it up to them.
Naturally, a bit regretful.
Because after he learns the truth about things, he's like, well, we can't actually reverse any of this at all. It's all a lie. So we just got to do the best we can with what we've got here. And try to make sure that this can't happen again. So he's got the sword now, and he's going to use it to finish off all of the Venerate, which will allow them to close the rift, which will prevent Shamaloth from ending the world.
This is all within the first book?
No, we're like halfway through the second book at this point.
Okay.
Very much abridged commentary.
This is These are all like 800-page books, so I mean, this is still like
skimming.
A cursory overview. And eventually Asha learns about this vessel. The vessels are like this device that can be used to infused with essence to do certain things. And apparently there's a vessel that exists that is siphoning energy off all of the shadows in the world.
Oh.
Because of course you need essence to live. It's life energy. You can't go without it. And so obviously the shadows still have essence. They just can't wield it, in any sort of...
They can't tap into it, as it were.
Right. But the reason that is because someone, a long time ago made this vessel that is, sort of gradually stealing all of their energy, or just a trickle at a time from all of the shadows. So there's like a huge, massive pile of energy at their disposal. They just didn't know about it. This will become much important later. And so much of book 2 is Caden going around fighting the Venerate and trying to just kill them to make sure that they don't cause any more trouble and don't release Shamaloth upon the world and let him end it. And
kind of low stakes for them, I suppose, since they're immortal.
Yeah. But, of course, he has Licanius, which allows him to kill them permanently. So they're trying to get the sword from him, and he doesn't want to do that. So Davian is kind of the augurs are also connected to this rift, which allows them to use the same power that the Venerate have to manipulate time. It's called Con. It's a very
That's a
different
Star
sort of-
Trek guy, right?
Yeah. They
Yeah.
don't routinely scream Con, though.
Oh, okay. Spock doesn't die?
No,
There's no,
Spock
there's no
dying.
wrath.
Okay.
Or there's a little bit of wrath though.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
there's probably some wrath, but anyway,
Could tell us about the Wrath of Khan.
Yeah.
I could. This power ties them to the rift, but it also keeps the rift open at the same time.
Hmm.
So they discover that they're going to have to kill all of the augurs in order to close the rift.
Ah.
Mm.
So is that
Which
why they
is-
were all killed in the first place?
No.
Or is
They
that
were
just
all-
because they were
that
wrong?
was like a strictly military thing.
Ah.
We learn eventually that someone was like, one of the guys who records the visions was, just making stuff up.
Ah.
So he just wanted to start a revolution against the augurs for kicks.
I see.
Because he wanted to have some power.
Right.
So, meanwhile, the boundary continues to deteriorate further, and a bunch of scary creatures escape and attack the capital again, this time accompanied by one of the Venerate, who has been released from her little cell in the boundary, that essentially there are several members of the Venerate who kind of turned to the good side, as it were, and placed themselves in these little machines that siphon off their essence to power the boundary.
Mm-hmm.
And by removing her from it, it's been weakened. And so that's why they're able to escape, get some people and scary creatures out of it. So that happens, and Isiliar, the Venerate lady, attacks, and Caden fights her off and kills her and all that good stuff. And so we come to the third book, and Caden is... Oh, I totally forgot to mention this, but this is in the second book too. Caden learns that he is, in fact, the person named Talcamar. So the guy that helped Davian and Wur in the first place,
Because of timey-wimey
because
stuff.
of timey-wimey stuff, he is in fact Talcamar and Caden. They're the same person.
I see.
I see.
We also learn that Malshash is in fact also the same person.
Oh.
So 3 of the people that have been helping out Davian are all in fact the
One
same
man.
dude. The same dude.
3 people, 1 guy.
And we're not done yet.
I see.
The big bad leader of the bad guys on the other side of the boundary, his name is Arcane Divide, is also in fact Talcamar.
Oh, goodness.
Oh.
But before, that was his name that he took on to sort of be the big bad before he turned to the good side. So he's not actually over there anymore, but they sort of use that threat to kind of subdue them. So
timey-wimey stuff.
Caden has been around and doing some timey-wimey stuff, and
Yeah.
like 4 different iterations of him are, affecting things in the present.
Sharing a space and time. That's
Dang.
weird.
But of course, they're all just names for the same dude doing
Right.
stuff at different points in time.
Mm-hmm.
So there's
In
a lot
his
of that
timeline.
going on, and the timey-wimey is very confusing throughout much of the second book and difficult to explain, so I'll omit all of that.
Mhm.
At the start of the third book, he's getting very close to wrapping up, getting rid of all of the Venerate, and kind of has to face the reality of, killing off the augurs in order to close the rift.
Mm-hmm.
And meanwhile, Davian is captured towards the end of the second book by another one of the Venerate named Cassandrid, who's kind of like the leader of the remaining bad guy venerates. And he gets taken to Talon Gall, the big, kind of the, I don't know, Mordor equivalent.
Sure. The evil country.
The evil country in which all of the bad guy reside. And
Billie Eilish is
he's
dancing on the gate.
And they're like, you're a problem. We're going to throw you into this time limbo, and you're going to mine metal for us for a while. Because we don't want you in here for sure. So they throw him into this time limbo realm that happens to be Ghassandrid's old home city that he kind of ripped out of time and threw in there because he wanted to keep it. And it happens to have, because it's weird timey-wiminess, has this metal in it that's very valuable because it doesn't follow normal timey-wimey rules, and it basically doesn't decay because everything behind the boundary is slowly decaying because it's kind of cut off from essence, more or less. So it's not affected by that. So they like that. They're like, go get metal for us. Davian befriends a guy there named Rayleth, who is kind of this. He's a big believer in El. Belief in El is sort of diminished in the present era. And of course, Zvalar, the world where he got thrown into, is timey-wimey. And so there's people from all sorts of different times. And Rayleth is from a long time ago when, the old religion, as they call it, was still widely practiced. So you could call him something of an El apologist and theologian. He kind of knows his stuff. He has some arguments and discussions with Davy and kind of plants some seeds in his mind about that. Turns out, of course, that there's another Talkamar in this timey-wimey home.
Of course.
Because why not? And he teaches Davian some more powers, and they're like, oh, you're going to get really strong here. This will be great, and then you'll be able to beat all the baddies. And so they do. Meanwhile, back in regular timeline, Ur is sort of getting invaded by the aforementioned country, Desriel, and they're bringing these weapons of mass destruction to wipe out basically the whole country. And so they're kind of marching them under an illusion to go plant them on this plateau that's relatively centrally located and blow everything up.
Just magic nukes.
Magic continent-wide nukes.
Oh.
And that's obviously something we'd like to avoid.
Sounds kind of like that, yeah.
And at this point, the capital has kind of been decimated, and some of the southern provinces have backed out and receded from the Union. And so they're kind of on their own. They've got an army of 1,000
southern
men.
provinces like to do, I guess.
As southern provinces are wont to do. Sorry to all of you southerners out there.
All two of you.
All two of you. As they fight this giant battle at the end, with 1,000 versus, 15,000. And
every guy just needs to kill 15. That's no big deal.
Some nukes that you die if you touch them. So they're sacrificing men every day just to haul them further. Because they drain essence when you touch them. Prevent you from using that. So, big battle. They sort of win. Caden shows up, finishes them off. And they're like, all right, we all got to go to Delanis to stop Shamaloth because they blew up one of the last good guy Venerate. Because his little tributary was sitting there on that plateau. They didn't actually get to activate the continental nukes, but they still just drained a lot of energy just by being there.
Mm-hmm.
And so the boundary is kind of fully broken down at this point, and they're like, well, we either got to stop Shamaloth from getting in here, or the world is doomed. And Asha has the vessel that allows her to use all of the power of the shadows.
Ooh.
So she just puts up a big barrier of essence, which is the only thing that Shamaloth can't really get through. And so they fight him off, and they win. Hooray.
Hooray.
That's just great.
Davian has, for a long time, had this vision that he is going to die convincing Talkamar that he's wrong, that he's being lied to. And so, at the very end of this, Davian figures, well, we're in the time portal city, and I gotta go back in time and tell you you're wrong. And then I'll be the last augur dead, and you can finally close the rift, and this will all be over. But Talkamar says, nope. I'm gonna do it. So he takes the time portal to find Rayleth in his own time. And Rayleth and his wife have had a baby who is, they find out, is actually Davian.
Oh.
A long, long time ago. Because they sort of just found him as an orphan way back in the beginning times.
Yep.
And so he says, I'm going to need to take that baby from you. And they're like, but it's my baby. It's like, trust me, we got to do this. Of course,
I'll explain later.
Rayleth and his wife knew Davian on Zvalar, so they know who Davian is because they've spent so much time with him before they had him, because timey-wimey.
Goodness.
Dear goodness. It's like, hey, that's my own.
So they
stole my baby.
They know how critical it is that they surrender their son so that he can save the world. But it doesn't make it any less hard.
Of course not.
So he goes and delivers the baby to Teiris so that he can go get raised in Caladel and do all the things that he does. And then finally, they pick up the power to shapeshift along the way for reasons so that they can get out of Zvalar safely. But he shapeshifts into Davian and goes and talks to himself. It convinces him that he's wrong. And of course, past Talkamar, in a fit of rage, he thinks being lied to, kills Davian. And that's what happens in the vision.
Okay.
And that's
kills
the end.
Davian, but not Davian.
But kills Davian, but
but
actually
no.
himself.
Oh, so suicide by Davian.
Suicide by appearing to be Davian.
I see.
So he goes back in time to his past self, and his past self kills him, thus
so Gemini
ending
Man.
him. Yeah, and that's the end of it. We got there.
Dang, son.
So there's lots of very, very fun, timey-wimey confusingness, head hurt. Oh my goodness. What on earth is going on?
It's not so much a timeline as a time yarn ball.
It's a Jeremy Baramy. A callback to the Good Place.
Yep.
The unit of time in the Good Place is a Jeremy Baramy. Time doesn't move in a straight line here. It moves in a Jeremy Baramy. And it's
like
like
a Christopher Nolan film if it was not.
it's like the signature in cursive of a guy, Jeremy Baramy, and that's like how the time moves in as I audibly sign out the words Jeremy Baramy with my fingers. But yeah. So what are your guys' impressions based on that extremely high level overview of what goes on?
Basically, a guy does a dramatic feedback loop of himself until he dies.
It sounds like it goes off the rails really fast, but also gets really interesting.
It is very, very intriguing.
What was the name of the Satan guy? Because I keep wanting to say Sephiroth, and I know that's not
That's
right.
Final Fantasy.
Shamaloth.
Whatever happens with him, is that resolved?
I believe
Is he just shoved back in the...
A guy with a gigantic sword and a guy with a gun for an arm and a lady who can fight. They all go fight him in his one-winged angel form.
People are already
as
confused.
he meteors.
So that's another Final Fantasy reference there. But they fend him off at Daelonis and seal the rift. You know,
I
that's
see.
like
Okay.
they're standing there like.
But in order for that to last, then the guys go and die.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Talkamar
So-
needs to go and
Takamar, yeah.
It wasn't the shadow magic
shadow-
burst.
the
turned
shadow
him back?
lady only held him out.
Okay.
Did she ever recover her memories or anything, or did she just become a new person?
She definitely recovered her memories, not like directly, but people just told her, what had happened before.
I see. So
She
what was the
eventually
reason why their school was wiped out then?
Because they knew Davian was there, and they were trying to.
I see.
They were trying to kill him.
I see. Interesting. So yes, it does sound like very much brain hurt and something I will probably end up chewing on at some point.
It does make
Mentally,
a lot
of
more
course, while
sense when you actually read it and are,
I'm sure.
You're fed this information at the pace and timing it's supposed to.
As opposed to an hour-long podcast.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not even sure I'll be able to keep most of the names straight, even though they all
There-
talk
yeah,
about the same
there's-
guy.
There's just a lot of names.
And they're all high
And
fantasy
half of them are
letter
one
salad
guy.
names.
Precisely.
But yes,
But-
it sounds very deep and complex and something that is already sort of making me want to read it.
And so
What did you like about it, having read it?
the biggest couple of things that I thought were really, really interesting, like I mentioned at the beginning of this part, how really solid Christian theology is used as a plot device in this series.
Mm-hmm.
In the first book, they're having a discussion. I forget who is doing it. It might be Caden. But they're, Davian and I think Caden are having a discussion about, is El in control of anything going on here? Shamaloth is this obvious acting force, and he has all of these manifestly evil creatures at his disposal, and they're just killing things left and right. And so can El possibly exist? If he did, how could he be allowing any of this to happen?
Mm-hmm.
This classic problem of evil.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, well, in reality, El has already won. He has imprisoned Shamaloth, and he's going to expel him from the world, and he will reverse everything that's happened here. It's his victory is assured. It's just a matter of time. So,
A whole lot
and
of
course
time.
they're a little deceived about that fact, but because El never actually makes an appearance in the series, but it's they do a really good job of talking about the problem of evil in a way that's relevant to the state of the world at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And also Rayleth's conversations with Davian on Zvalar about whether El exists and whether he's in control of things, and morality. They talk a lot about moral courses of action and whether they can do this justifiably to save the world and stuff.
Because there's a whole lot of deciding to kill people because that needs to happen for one reason or another.
Right.
Are all of those killings, justified? Are the wars just,
Mm-hmm.
That kind of questions.
Yeah.
And then there's like the whole deal, like, because they have to kill all the Venerate, right, in order to accomplish this. So, like,
Right.
what's their origin? Like, where do they?
No one knows.
Okay,
It's a
Okay.
mystery.
I see.
And they're all like several millennia old.
Mm-hmm.
And so like they didn't even all know each other at the beginning. They just kind of existed for a really long time and eventually heard some stories about other people that simply don't die. And
Mhm.
they all kind of got together over time.
Mm-hmm.
And
I
so,
see.
I mean, there's not a lot of, like, super direct allegory here.
Mm-hmm.
But it looks
That
like there's
I-
a lot.
There's some very obvious, this is Christian theology, but there's no, like, super specific allegory.
This character is Jesus.
Yeah, there's no
this
one-to-one.
character is this character.
There's no one-to-one comparison.
Yeah, no.
Right.
A lot of allegory, a lot of symbolism, but
I don't think you can even call it allegory, like the whole Elv Shema
Sure,
thing,
sure.
because it's so blatantly obvious who they're supposed to represent. Like,
Mhm.
they literally use one of the names of God in the Bible for,
Right. Yeah.
for
Which is,
God.
yeah.
So
Mhm.
I don't even consider that allegory. I consider that just like putting your cards on the table and saying,
Mhm.
this is how it is.
By the way.
Which I find kind of almost refreshingly funny.
Mhm.
Because fantasy writers like to be cryptic.
Yep. To the
I
point
mean,
where he's
this-
just like,
this
I'm
guy-
just going to be blunt about it.
James Islington is also cryptic, but about more interesting things.
right.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I'm kind of curious about is how do they resolve the whole shadow situation? Because she finds the stockpile of like shadow energy or shadow life energy. Who made that? And why were they doing that to the shadows?
They wanted to just use all of the energy for whatever purposes they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually
So they were
had,
discarding these people who didn't pass the test just to use their energy.
more or less.
I see.
And
So exploiting them, basically.
mm-hmm. Were at one point changes the tenets because he has this, there's a moment where they're fighting one of the battles because the blind are technically people, they can't fight back against them. And so he modifies the tenets in order to allow them to fight, basically. And
I
he, once he takes over as more or less the king, he sort of stops the practice of turning people into shadows.
Mm-hmm. Very cool.
So,
Neat. Well, I suppose with unless there's anything else.
there's a few other points I want to make. Wur is another one of the really interesting characters as far as like moral decision making goes.
Sure.
Like we just discussed, like he has the ability to change these rules that govern how people live just on a whim. And yet he strictly refuses to do so because he considers it not to be moral. Because it would sort of... He believes that the restrictions that are placed on the gifted are a good thing. Like, it's needed to maintain a balance of power between them and the ordinary people.
Mm-hmm.
And so he wants to ensure that there are some safeguards for the common good
Mm-hmm.
so that they can't just, be the tyrants of the whole nation just because they happen to have powers and other people don't.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, he thinks that, some of the rules are too overbearing and don't let the gifted, contribute to society the way they should.
Right.
And so he has this really great way of, struggling through decisions, but he's got this great moral compass that lets him choose the best road in a way that doesn't abuse his power.
Mm.
Destiny.
So he's very discerning and sort of an anti-despot, as it were.
Yes, he's a super duper anti-despot. He also has a thing called an oath stone, which allows him to command anyone who has the mark. And so he can just give them an order and they do it. But he also doesn't use that, except with their permission to, like, effectively communicate and order them on the battlefield and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So he has this tremendous power, yet he's using it very, very conscientiously and discerningly.
That is very cool. Takes a lot of character to not just abuse power like that.
And there's points at which it would have been a lot easier had he just done that. It probably would have been more effective and, like, saved lives if he'd just, like, taken matters into his own hands. But he really strongly believes in maintaining this order and representation from both sides, that he, makes sure to include other people's opinions and their consent before doing things like that.
Because even though, like, short term it might have caused some good, he's afraid of, like, the long-term effects and, like, I suppose, like,
how
the
does
eventual
me making one decision like this affect me making other decisions
down the road. Yeah.
If I let this go an inch, where's the next inch going to go?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The magic system is also really creative and interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of the ways that it's a very creative ability. You can it's limited more or less by your imagination what you can do with it.
So, like Green Lantern ring.
Not quite that flexible, but, like, Asha will make, like, a suit of essence armor and a sword that she uses just because she has so much essence at her disposal. She can, like, make almost concrete objects out of it. So it's, I think for Asha it's basically Green Lantern powers, but for an ordinary person, not so much.
All right. Well,
yeah. If you like reading, it's a good...
and want to sort of wreck your brain a little bit while you do so?
If you don't want to have your brain wrecked, you can start the podcast at about minute 59. And
depending on how it... depending on how this comes out.
Depending on how it gets edited. But
yeah. Cool beans.
That's
so I guess
all I have.
For the cool stuff anyway, what about the transcendental analysis?
Truth.
Abusing power is bad.
Yeah.
Making moral decisions based on the input of both people on sides of a disagreement is a good thing to do.
It seems to me that a lot of fantasy, like particularly with this and Lord of the Rings, for example, power is sort of represented as corrupting and the need to treat it very seriously. And that's sort of the center of a lot of conflict.
Well, it happened in Lord of the Rings, and thus it happens in every subsequent fantasy novel ever. Because Tolkien is the gold standard of fantasy. And as all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato, all of fantasy is a footnote to Tolkien.
But yeah, that's an interesting dynamic. It's not as if there's anything inherent to power so much as it is power's or the allure of use of power to suit one's own ends corrupts people. And so it's interesting that in this book, it's not like with it's not like the power automatically just sort of corrupts him. He's, like, very careful to, like, place limits on himself so that he doesn't abuse it. And I feel like that's sort of reflective of, like, in our own lives when there's things where, like, if we're lax and we allow ourselves to be undisciplined with our lives, that can, wreak havoc and affect others in negative ways.
How
if we
appropriate for our Lent,
as
we're recording it during Lent.
Hopefully
you haven't given up podcasts for Lent.
Yeah. As we make or maybe this is your Lenten sacrifices listening to our podcast. Thanks for being here. But like we place limits on ourselves voluntarily, especially during the season of Lent, so that we can build that habit of virtuous self-control.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
And so that when with relatively small things, that will strengthen up the muscles of the will, as it were, to be able to stop ourselves in the big things when we need to. So it's interesting how that plays out and it's represented in Were particularly, as I see it.
What
Yeah,
else you got to
and
pull
once
from
again,
this?
there's like a very heroic moment of self-sacrifice at the
Mhm.
very end. You know,
Mhm.
I mean, Davian is prepared to, sacrifice his own life to ensure the good of the world.
And
But
so Davian
know-
is one of the immortal guys, right?
no, he's
He's a augur.
Oh no,
he's a
og-
human. He's just a normal human, but he's an
Okay.
augur.
But he doesn't actually go back to sacrifice himself. That was
No.
was the immortal guy.
The immortal
Yes.
guy takes on his form and goes in his
Right,
place.
right.
Taking on the form of a man, as it were, and dying to save.
Dying
The
to
rest.
self.
Yes,
Literally.
dying to self. Dying by
So-
and to self.
The other time version self had the sword that could kill himself because immortal being.
Yes.
Okay. Just that was something that crossed my mind when you were explaining that scene, and I'm like, when and how. Anyway, that it makes more sense when you read it, I imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah. It definitely
It's interesting
does.
too, like obviously essence is a very sort of metaphysical term. And that's like the source of power in this universe.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess we could dive into that a little bit.
I'm not sure that there's a super precise analogy to it, because
Sure.
essence in an Aristotelian metaphysical sense is more like what a thing is,
True.
and its essence is a contingent upon and a composite of its matter and its form.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this essence is more just like life,
The essence-
energy, ether,
The essence
sort of
is
thing.
like it's matter in the Aristotelian sense that can be formed however it wants, however the user wills it to be.
I see.
So it's not exactly the same sort of idea, but I guess you could see it that way.
Sure. Any other truths we can elicit from this book series?
Be willing to question yourself. If Talcamar had not, when he first heard that, someone telling him his entire life is a lie, basically, he was unwilling to accept it. He was unwilling to change his ways, and he just got angry and killed the guy who told him that.
Mhm.
But if there's any figure who I think is sort of blatantly allegorical, it's Talcamar, and I think he's St. Paul. Because
Oh.
he sort of, someone comes and says, why are you persecuting me, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And
And is that the
He-
moment that convinces him to change?
that's the moment that he looks back on, later, and he begins to question whether he's really following El or not.
Mm-hmm.
And he realizes he's actually following Shamaloth eventually. So,
I see.
yeah, consider whether the ends justify the means. Because El was like routinely telling them, "Oh yeah, just go and wipe out this entire race." Go
Is that a thing that El would say?
Think about that. Like, would God tell you to wipe out an entire race of people?
Sounds-
Even if he could go and redo it all, turn back time and make it not happen, is that a thing a good God would ask you to do?
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what a lot of people, when they look at the Old Testament, they'll be like, "Well, what's the deal with this?" Because like sometimes God's like, "Yeah, go attack that other tribe," but there's sort of some different nuances to that.
Yeah.
that biblical scholars have debated over the years, but
Also, the economy of salvation was a lot different back before Jesus, so
that
that's a
and
different
there was
discussion.
sort of what the modern reader of the Bible often forgets is that
The world was a very different place back then.
the world was a very different place. It was very much kill or be killed if you had a civilization. So God God having chosen these people,
It's like, hey,
to
I
be
want
the
you to
chosen
survive
people,
at all.
he had to use, he had to work through the, he had to make sure that these people were not annihilated by another civilization in order that his plan might come to fulfillment. Obviously God is a mystery, but so I guess that's one thing, I suppose, like when that came to my mind when
If someone asks you to do a genocide,
Stop
consider
and
whether
think
or not
about
it's a good thing.
Consider the
Yes.
following.
yes. So I guess
The good?
goodness. What is good? What is good in these
What's good?
books?
My dude.
Just a lot of the relationships between the characters,
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
The good king and that basically king as well, like we discussed before.
Yeah, where eventually does, in fact, more or less become the king. So he's just like, it's good that someone is willing to do the hard right thing instead of the
Easy
know,
wrong thing.
easy wrong thing,
Just to get to the same end point.
right? It might not even be the same endpoint, but it's like, it's putting your own self-interest aside and doing the right thing no matter what the easier way might be.
Mm-hmm.
What else is
People fighting to
good?
keep evil in check.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Always a good thing.
Always a good thing.
Then, of course, the sacrifice at the end
Mm-hmm.
for the sake of, I want to say Damien. That's not his name.
He literally redeems himself by dying.
Yeah.
Talcamar, Caden.
Tuckamar. Yep.
Caden is the name he goes by now because
There's the other thing you could say, like connection with Paul, as he changes his name when he changes his
he
ways.
becomes a very different person after he regains his memories and becomes friends with Davian.
Davian, that's what his name is.
And so, he decides to keep that name because it represents who he is now.
Mm-hmm.
So, just another reason why I think he's Paul.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He's very Paulin, as it were. Beauty. What is beautiful in these books? How's his prose, the author?
It's good. This is his first published work, so it's not the
Yeah,
most...
he's a contemporaneous author, I suppose.
I mean, it's the first... No, this is the first thing he's ever... Like, the first book in this series was the first thing he ever published, so... There's definitely some points where you can tell that it's definitely the first thing he's ever written, to publish. I would say it's not lacking in beauty, but nor is the imagery and scenery really come to life in the same way that Tolkien's does.
Mm-hmm. Which isn't to some people's taste, I suppose, with Tolkien.
Yeah.
It's a complaint for the people that aren't inclined to be fans, but a
selling
part of-
point for people who like
people
it.
who are, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess there's that.
So
His imagery, his description of places it's just not as filled out as a lot of other authors are, just simply because they're more experienced.
Mhm.
It does
But he has these
improve.
very complex and fleshed out, it seems more or less,
Yeah,
effectively, concepts and dynamics of this world that he's creating.
yeah. It really is much more of a cerebral
And like
series.
abstract
Uh-huh.
as opposed to
Sure.
concrete, sort of more of a thought experiment than a complete fantasy, I suppose.
Right. I
On
don't
that
think
s-
it's devoid of beauty, but that's not the highlight.
it's
The
not a strong point.
The
Yeah.
truth is really the highlight.
Yeah. Unity. What draws all this timey-wimey crazy stuff together?
Caden.
Yes.
/
All-
Talkamar / Arcane Divide / Malshash. All the same dude.
Slash all
He's-
5 of him.
It's basically his story.
It really
Wait,
is.
Is that how we have 2 listeners? Like we just
That's
have
exactly how.
2 people in different
It's
points in time?
different. It's different because we have. They're all instantiations of the same dude.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
true.
the substance is of that particular dude is
Remains
constant.
intact.
It just has a different name applied to it.
I see.
I don't think it's analogous to our 2
To our two.
viewers. Because then it would just all be instantiations of the same people. Which
As
of
far
course
as we
it's
know,
not.
that's not the case. Well, good deal. Neat. Well,
Very neat.
I guess if people want
If
to...
your brain doesn't melt, if you listen to the whole summary, you're a champion. You're doing your Lenten penance there. Good on you guys.
Good
Good job.
Even
If
chops down a little bit to conserve time, which
So
you probably won't notice.
If they want to continue their Lenten penance, where can they find us?
Thanks for listening to the Palladian Papist, your Lenten Penance TM. You can listen to us on Spotify.
Episode title right there.
What's that?
Your Lenten penance TM episode title.
Yep. There it is. You can listen to us on Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Palapapus. Unless you gave us up for Lent, you're not missing out on much because I'm very inconsistent. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or complaints, or suggestions for future episodes, email us at palladiumpapist@gmail.com. And we will speak with you again next week. Bye.
Bye.
See you in Tiny Wonderland.